The sound that wakes you isn't the explosion, it's the silence that follows. You're lying in bed at 2:17 in the morning when the power grid collapses across 6 city blocks, and in that first disorienting moment of absolute darkness, your brain doesn't register danger, it registers confusion. The hum of your refrigerator, the glow of your alarm clock, the distant ambient noise of traffic signals and streetlights, all of it vanishes in the same instant. What you don't realize in those first few seconds is that approximately 11,000 other people in your immediate vicinity just experienced the same sensory disruption, and every single one of them is about to make a series of calculations that will determine whether your neighborhood becomes a functional mutual aid network or descends into territorial competition within 72 hours. The screaming starts around hour 6, when the first wave of panic buying strips the local convenience stores bare, and people begin to understand that the systems they've depended on for their entire lives aren't coming back online according to any predictable timeline. But it's what happens after the screaming stops that reveals whether you've prepared for the right crisis. Most survival preparation operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how social collapse actually unfolds in modern urban and suburban environments. The popular image involves roaming gangs, immediate violence, and a rapid descent into Mad Max-style chaos within hours of a triggering event. This Hollywood conception has convinced millions of people that the primary threat they face during a major disruption is external marauders attempting to breach their fortified homes. They've purchased firearms, stockpiled ammunition, reinforced their doors, and mentally prepared for a scenario where they'll need to defend their property against waves of desperate strangers. But the actual progression of neighborhood-level collapse follows a completely different pattern. One rooted in network theory, social psychology, and the specific vulnerabilities of modern infrastructure interdependencies. The real danger isn't the stranger breaking down your door on day 1. It's your neighbor 3 houses down who knows you have a generator because he heard it running on day 2. Who knows your family's routine because he's watched you leave for work every morning for 5 years, and who makes a calculated decision on day 3 that his children's hunger outweighs his previous social conditioning against property violation. This is the threat vector that almost no one prepares for, because it requires acknowledging that the greatest tactical disadvantage you face isn't insufficient ammunition or inadequate fortification. It's information asymmetry in a small world network where everyone already knows everyone else's resources, routines, and vulnerabilities. The 72-hour window operates as a critical threshold in disaster sociology for reasons that most people don't fully appreciate until they've experienced it directly. During the first 24 hours of a major disruption, human behavior remains largely governed by normalcy bias and social conditioning. People assume the problem is temporary, that authorities will restore services imminently, and that the social contract governing everyday interactions will remain intact. They might complain, they might experience anxiety, but they generally don't abandon the behavioral norms that keep civil society functioning. The second day introduces the first cracks in this framework. Refrigerated food begins to spoil. Prescription medications run out for people who didn't maintain buffer stocks. Parents with young children start calculating how many diapers remain. Anyone dependent on electrically powered medical equipment begins facing life-threatening situations. The cellular networks, which might have functioned on backup power through day 1, start experiencing cascading failures as individual tower batteries die and can't be recharged. This communication breakdown prevents people from gathering accurate information about the scope and expected duration of the crisis, which paradoxically accelerates panic rather than containing it. By the end of the second day, the psychological transition from inconvenience to emergency has occurred in most people's minds. The third day is when game theory overtakes social conditioning. People begin making calculations they wouldn't have considered 48 hours earlier, weighing the risk of action against the certainty of deprivation. And this is precisely when neighborhoods either coalesce into cooperative defense networks or fracture into competing household units with no collective security structure. The reason this progression matters from a tactical standpoint comes down to something called the defender's dilemma in asymmetric conflict scenarios. If you're sitting inside your home with stockpiled resources, you're defending a known position against potential adversaries who can choose the timing, approach vector, and method of any attempt to acquire your supplies. You might have weapons and fortifications, but you also have massive disadvantages that most tactical preparation completely ignores. You need to sleep. You have limited sight lines from inside a residential structure. You can't maintain 360-degree security awareness without multiple trained personnel working in shifts. You're defending infrastructure designed for comfort and energy efficiency, not security, which means multiple entry points, windows that provide easy visual surveillance of your interior activities, and walls that offer concealment but not cover in any meaningful ballistic sense. Most critically, you're attempting to defend this position while also managing all the other survival necessities, like water purification, food preparation, waste disposal, and family stress management, which means your security attention is constantly divided. Meanwhile, anyone who decides your resources are worth acquiring can spend hours or days conducting surveillance, identifying your patterns, determining your defensive capabilities, and waiting for the optimal moment to act. They don't need to succeed in a direct assault. They just need to make remaining in your location untenable, which could mean anything from cutting your water line to starting a fire in an adjacent structure to simply making enough threatening noise that you abandon your position out of fear. This is where the fundamental insight emerges that differentiates effective neighborhood defense from individual fortress mentality. The only reliable way to address the defender's dilemma is to eliminate information asymmetry by creating a transparent, cooperative network before the crisis occurs. If everyone on your street knows that 7 households have agreed to mutual defense, that they've cross-trained on each other's skills, that they've inventoried combined resources, and that any threat to one household triggers a coordinated response from all 7, the game theory calculation changes completely. A potential aggressor no longer faces a single defending unit with divided attention and limited manpower. They face a network that can maintain continuous surveillance, respond with numerical superiority, and coordinate defensive actions across multiple positions. More importantly, the information asymmetry reverses. Instead of outsiders knowing which houses contain valuable resources while defenders remain ignorant of threats, the neighborhood network knows every resident, every vehicle, every pattern, and can immediately identify anomalies. This isn't about creating a vigilante militia, it's about building what emergency management professionals call a resilient community network, where the social connections that exist during normal times can rapidly convert into functional mutual aid and security cooperation during crisis periods. The practical implementation of this concept requires understanding that you're not preparing for a hypothetical future scenario. You're building relationships and establishing protocols right now during normal times that will automatically activate when disruption occurs. This is harder than buying more ammunition, which is precisely why most people don't do it. It requires having conversations with neighbors that feel awkward because they violate the normal suburban social contract of polite distance. It means admitting vulnerability by discussing your preparations and resources with people you might not fully trust yet. It demands time investment in community meetings, skill-sharing sessions, and relationship building that doesn't provide the immediate psychological satisfaction of acquiring more gear. But the mathematics of small unit tactics makes this social preparation non-negotiable if you're serious about security rather than just security theater. A single person attempting to defend a residential structure has effectively zero chance of maintaining that defense for 72 continuous hours against even moderately organized opposition. 3 households working together increase defensive capability by far more than 3 times because they can rotate watch schedules, establish overlapping fields of observation, and respond to threats before they reach any individual position. 7 to 12 households create a network large enough to establish genuine perimeter security while still being small enough that everyone knows everyone else personally, which is the critical threshold for maintaining trust and coordination under stress. The communication infrastructure for this network needs to exist before you need it, and it can't depend on cellular networks or internet connectivity that will fail in exactly the scenarios where you need coordination most. This is where most neighborhood preparation efforts fail, because they assume that when crisis hits, people will naturally figure out how to work together. But human behavior under stress doesn't support this assumption. When the power goes out and cell phones stop working, people retreat to their individual households and wait for authorities to fix the problem. They don't spontaneously organize because they lack the pre-existing communication channels, established leadership structures, and practiced protocols that would make coordination possible. The solution involves old technology that most people have forgotten exists. FRS and GMRS radios cost less than $50 per unit and work regardless of infrastructure status. If every participating household has radios programmed to the same channels with pre-established communication schedules, you maintain coordination capability even in total grid-down scenarios. The key is practicing this before crisis hits, which means scheduled radio checks, establishing code words for different threat levels, and making sure everyone knows the protocols well enough that they become automatic. This sounds paranoid during normal times, which is exactly why it doesn't happen, and exactly why neighborhoods fragment during actual emergencies instead of coordinating effectively. The resource pooling conversation is where most people's operational security instincts conflict with tactical reality. The prepper mythology emphasizes operational security above nearly everything else, warning people never to reveal their preparations to anyone because it makes them a target. This advice makes sense if you're genuinely planning to defend resources alone against all comers. But it's suicidal advice if you understand that individual defense is tactically impossible. The alternative approach involves selective transparency within your trusted network. If 7 households have agreed to mutual defense, they need to know each other's capabilities in order to coordinate effectively. This doesn't mean advertising your preparations to the entire neighborhood or posting your stockpile inventory on social media. It means having frank conversations with the specific people you've decided to trust about who has medical training, who has water filtration capacity, who has food reserves, who has tactical experience, and who has critical skills like mechanical repair or electrical knowledge. The combined capability of 7 moderately prepared households vastly exceeds what any single well-prepared household can achieve alone, because specialization becomes possible. Not everyone needs to stockpile everything. One household might focus on water security, another on food storage, another on medical supplies, another on communication equipment. As long as the network holds together, everyone benefits from the combined resources while reducing individual vulnerability to catastrophic loss if any single location is compromised. The security patrol protocol is where theory has to translate into actual boots on the ground. And this is where most neighborhood groups fail because they underestimate how exhausting and boring security work actually becomes. The romantic vision involves armed citizens standing vigilant watch over their community. But the reality involves trying to stay alert at 3 in the morning on your 4th consecutive night of disrupted sleep while nothing happens hour after hour. Humans are terrible at maintaining vigilance during prolonged periods of low-stimulus observation, which is why military organizations spend enormous resources on training and discipline to overcome this natural human limitation. Neighborhood defense networks don't have this training infrastructure, which means protocols need to account for realistic human performance under stress and fatigue. The practical solution involves very short watch rotations, maybe 2 hours maximum, with multiple people on each shift who can keep each other alert. It means establishing specific observation positions that cover the most likely approach routes, rather than trying to watch everything everywhere. It means having clear escalation protocols so individual watchstanders know exactly when to wake others versus handling situations themselves. Most critically, it means practicing these protocols during normal times, so they're automatic when crisis hits. A neighborhood that tries to organize security patrols for the first time after the power goes out will fail because nobody knows their positions, nobody's established communication protocols, nobody's tested whether their radios actually work at the required distances, and nobody's built the muscle memory that makes security procedures effective rather than just theatrical. The ethical framework for neighborhood defense raises questions that make most people deeply uncomfortable, but need to be addressed before crisis forces split-second decisions. At what point does your network respond to external threats with force? How do you handle neighbors who didn't participate in preparation but demand access to network resources when crisis hits? What's your policy on outsiders passing through the area versus outsiders who appear to be conducting surveillance? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical, tactical decisions that need established protocols before they arise in real time with lives on the line. The uncomfortable reality is that effective defense requires making decisions about resource allocation and threat response that feel morally complicated during peacetime, but become survival necessities during genuine collapse scenarios. The neighborhood network that spends time during normal periods discussing these scenarios, establishing agreed-upon thresholds, and creating decision-making frameworks will respond far more effectively than the network that tries to figure out their ethics in the moment. This doesn't mean establishing draconian rules or planning to shoot anyone who approaches. It means having nuanced conversations about graduated responses, about how to handle ambiguous situations, about balancing security needs against humanitarian impulses, and about who has authority to make different levels of decisions. The networks that navigate crisis successfully are almost always the ones who had these difficult conversations beforehand and established shared values that everyone understands and accepts. The infrastructure vulnerability that almost nobody accounts for in their preparation is water. Not in the sense of having water stored, but in the sense of what happens to modern residential plumbing when municipal water pressure disappears and sewage treatment stops functioning. Most suburban households have maybe 3 days of water stored if they're unusually prepared, and this assumes careful rationing. But the real crisis emerges around day 4 or 5, when toilets stop flushing effectively because there's no water pressure to refill tanks, and whatever water you're using for sanitation starts creating disease vectors in your immediate living environment. The historical record is unambiguous on this point. In every major urban disruption, from Hurricane Katrina to the Balkans conflicts to the Syrian civil war, waterborne disease and sanitation collapse killed more people than violence or starvation in the initial crisis phases. Modern humans are so far removed from this reality that they don't understand how quickly human waste accumulation becomes a life-threatening problem. Within a week, any neighborhood that hasn't established collective sanitation protocols will face disease outbreak that incapacitates people far more effectively than any external threat. The solution requires pre-planning that most people find too disgusting to think about during normal times, which is exactly why it doesn't happen and exactly why it becomes catastrophic when crisis hits. The neighborhood network needs to establish collective waste disposal before individual households create disease vectors that threaten everyone. This means identifying locations for latrine systems that are far enough from water sources to prevent contamination, but close enough to be realistically usable. It means stockpiling lime or other covering materials that control odor and disease transmission. It means establishing rotation schedules for maintenance, because nobody wants this job, but everyone's survival depends on it getting done consistently. Most critically, it means having the uncomfortable conversations during normal times about who's responsible for this essential but unpleasant work, because the network that can't coordinate basic sanitation isn't going to maintain cohesion when real security threats emerge. The households that attempt to handle waste disposal individually will fail because they lack the space, the knowledge, and the discipline to maintain safe protocols when exhaustion and stress erode judgment. The network approach allows specialization, allows experienced members to train others, and creates accountability that prevents the shortcuts that cause disease outbreak. This isn't glamorous preparation. It doesn't involve cool gear or tactical training, but it's more likely to determine survival outcomes than anything related to security, which is why it's ignored by most preparation frameworks that focus on exciting scenarios instead of unglamorous realities. The cascading psychological stress that emerges after 72 hours of disruption creates threats that purely tactical preparation doesn't address. Even well-prepared individuals start experiencing decision fatigue, anxiety, and fear responses that degrade judgment after multiple days of uncertainty. Parents with young children face amplified stress as they try to maintain calm while managing their own fear. Anyone with pre-existing mental health conditions may experience acute episodes as medication runs out and normal coping mechanisms become unavailable. The elderly face particular vulnerability because the routines and social connections that maintain their well-being evaporate, and isolation combined with uncertainty can trigger rapid cognitive decline. None of these are problems you can solve with firearms or fortifications, but all of them threaten your network's cohesion more than external security threats. The neighborhood that's prepared for this reality has identified who has medical or psychological training, who's naturally calm under pressure, who's good with children, and who can provide the emotional support that keeps people functional when everything feels like it's falling apart. This is where the gender dynamics of most tactical preparation reveal their inadequacy. The shooting and fighting focus attracts primarily men and ignores the reality that women often have more developed social intelligence and conflict resolution skills that become critical for maintaining network cohesion under stress. The most effective neighborhood defense networks aren't the ones with the most guns. They're the ones with the most balanced skill sets across both tactical and social support capabilities. The long-term sustainability question that most short-term preparation ignores is what happens when your stockpiled resources run out. 72 hours is a realistic time frame for municipal services to restore in many disaster scenarios, but it's not a realistic time frame for the kinds of systemic collapse that might be triggered by cyber attacks on infrastructure, electromagnetic pulse events, or cascading financial system failures. If you're preparing seriously, you need to think beyond consumption of stockpiles toward production of essentials. This is where neighborhood networks become non-negotiable because individual households can't maintain the diversity of production capabilities required for genuine sustainability. You need someone who knows food cultivation, someone who understands water system repair, someone with electrical and mechanical skills, someone who can provide medical care, someone who can maintain security equipment, and someone who can coordinate all these activities. The 7 to 12 household network allows this specialization while remaining small enough to maintain trust. Networks larger than 12 households start experiencing the free rider problems and coordination failures that undermine cooperation. Networks smaller than 7 lack the skill diversity and manpower to maintain all essential functions. This specific size range appears repeatedly in both anthropological research on human social groups and in after-action reports from communities that successfully navigated genuine collapse scenarios. It's not arbitrary. It reflects fundamental limitations on human social cognition and the mathematics of trust network scaling. The communication with external groups becomes critical if disruption extends beyond your immediate neighborhood, because isolation equals vulnerability in any extended crisis. Your network needs protocols for interfacing with adjacent neighborhoods, with any remaining law enforcement presence, and with potential mutual aid partners beyond your immediate area. This requires designated communication coordinators who can negotiate resource trades, share threat intelligence, and coordinate security responses across larger areas without compromising operational security for your specific network. The historical pattern from every major urban collapse shows that the neighborhoods who isolate completely either get overwhelmed by larger organized groups or slowly starve as their finite resources deplete. The neighborhoods who maintain external communication and trade relationships access the resource diversity and security depth that allows long-term survival. This doesn't mean advertising your capabilities to everyone. It means very careful, very selective relationship building with specific adjacent networks where mutual benefit seems probable and verification of capabilities seems possible. The network coordinator role requires people with diplomatic skills, judgment about who to trust, and enough tactical awareness to recognize when external groups pose threats versus opportunities. Most tactical preparation completely ignores this requirement because it focuses on the defensive siege mentality, but real-world survival depends more on alliance building than on isolated defense. The children represent both the greatest vulnerability and the greatest motivator for any neighborhood defense network, and their needs create requirements that most adult-focused preparation doesn't account for. Children can't maintain operational security because they don't understand why it matters. They need routine and normalcy to maintain psychological stability even when everything is disrupted. They require caloric intake disproportionate to their size because they're growing. They get sick more easily and recover more slowly than healthy adults. They make noise that compromises security. They need education and activity, or they become behavioral problems that stress adults who are already at their limits. Every one of these factors represents a tactical liability if you're thinking purely in defensive terms, but they're non-negotiable realities if actual families are involved. The network that's prepared for this has identified which adults are naturally good with children, has stockpiled activities and educational materials that keep kids occupied, has established childcare rotation schedules so parents get breaks, and has created spaces where children can be children, even when everything else is falling apart. This might sound like a luxury concern when you're worried about security, but the reality is that networks with unhappy, stressed, scared children will fracture far faster than networks that maintain some semblance of normalcy for kids. Parents will make irrational decisions, including abandoning otherwise sound defensive positions if their children are suffering and they believe they can improve the situation through action. The final reality that ties all of these elements together is that neighborhood defense isn't really about defense at all. It's about creating resilient social structures that can maintain essential functions when the formal systems that usually provide them have failed. The security component is necessary but subsidiary to the larger goal of maintaining life, health, and human dignity through a crisis period, until normal systems restore or new stable patterns emerge. This is why the networks that succeed look less like tactical units and more like village-scale communities with differentiated roles, mutual obligations, and shared investment in collective outcomes. The 3-day time frame matters because that's how long it takes for these social structures to either form or fail. And once fragmentation happens, it becomes nearly impossible to rebuild trust and coordination. Everything you do before crisis hits either builds toward this kind of resilient network or reinforces the isolated household mentality that guarantees failure under real pressure. The conversations you have with neighbors now, the relationships you build, the protocols you establish, the skills you develop, all of this either moves you toward networked resilience or leaves you trying to defend the indefensible when the screaming stops and the real crisis begins.